Welcome, everyone. Oh, I'm so excited all of you are here. And welcome to National Park Service Presents. This is very, very exciting. This is something that we started last year, and it has really kind of grown into this online series that we now run every other Tuesday, starting last couple weeks ago, and it will run all the way to the end of April. So every other Tuesday, all the way to the end of April, which will be April 26th. It's going to cover a whole multitude of topics. Today's topic is all about the North End, and I'm super excited because I've been a Bostonian my whole life, and I think I'm going to learn a lot of new things. I'm pretty pumped. And also make sure to check out the rest of this series, but also make sure you check out the National Park Service all their presentations on their own website. They are incredible, and I love them so much. Before we begin, though, let's go into some boring Zoom features. I know we've been doing Zoom for years and years and years, or at least it feels like it, but we'll go over a little bit. We are recording, okay? Like I said, hopefully not my ramble in the beginning is recorded, but the actual good stuff. Our entire series is recording and is on the Boston Public Library YouTube page. The best way to find it is just to Google Boston Public Library YouTube and it will pop up. And we have our entire playlist, so you can watch Ranger Merrill's from a couple weeks ago. He kicked off our season. And you can also catch a couple from last year when halfway through our season, we decided to start recording them because we had so much positive feedback from you guys. And look what you guys can do. And we make this for you and we want to take it in the direction where you guys want it. So cool beans. What else? Oh, the captions. If you just saw my caption say cool beans, that is something that I do enjoy saying, but you do not have to have them on. You can at the bottom, there's a CC button, click on it, you can hit hide caption. And as some of you guys have found that you can actually use the chat, which I'm really excited about, like I just did my light. But notice the two form. Okay, you can send things to just hosts and panelists, meaning people you only see on the screen, or you can send it to everyone, meaning everyone viewing the screen. So that's, what do we got? Over 100 people, which is really exciting. But, send it to whoever you'd like. Don't be shy. I really enjoy questions. Don't be shy. We just ask you be respectful. And what else do we got? Oh, and most likely questions will be kind of hoarded at the end, and Ranger Sean will pop up and he will ask your questions for you. Oh, and at the very, very end, we do have a survey that will pop up when things end. And if you could fill that out, that would be great. So I can adjust the program to how you want to see it. Anyway, I tend to babble. So without further babbling from me, let's welcome Ranger Jocelyn as she presents the North End, Boston's overlooked 19th century Black community. Woo!
Thank you, Karen. And let me just get my screen sharing going here. And it looks like we are good to go on that. So as Karen said, my name is Jocelyn Gould, and I'm extremely happy to be here tonight to talk about the North End and the Black community that lived there in the 19th century. Before we do begin, I would just like to let everybody know about two specific things that you'll encounter in tonight's talk. In a few of the newspaper clippings that you'll see and quotes that you'll hear, the word colored is used when speaking about Boston's Black community. And while that word is not really used today for a variety of reasons, in the 19th century, that was one of the most polite words to use when speaking about a Black or African-American individual, as opposed to many of the slurs that people use. The other thing that you will be hearing tonight is a brief discussion about sex work in the 19th century Boston in regards to one individual that I have researched. And if you're not comfortable with hearing about that profession during this time, this might not be the right talk for you, or you might want to watch the video later and skip ahead to the second person that I'm going to be talking about. And with that, I would just like to give you a very short introduction to the three National Park Service units located right in downtown Boston. The National Parks of Boston is comprised of 3 units of the National Park Service, and they are located both on the land of downtown and in the harbor of Boston Harbor. And they include Boston National Historical Park, which talks about the American Revolution, World War II, and innovation in technology. Boston African American National Historic Site, which focuses on the North Slope of Beacon Hill, where a free Black community resided and fought for equal rights and freedom. And also Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, which focuses not only on the amazing history of our city, but also the unique natural features as well. All these sites reside upon the land traditionally associated with the Massachusetts tribe, and I would like to begin my talk tonight by acknowledging them. This is a tribe of indigenous people from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name, and I would like to pay my respect to the ancestral bloodline of them and their descendants who still inhabit historical Massachusetts tribal territories to this day. So, the North End. I saw a lot of names that I associate with the North End in the participants list, so I know a lot of you are very familiar with it. But what comes to mind when you hear that neighborhood name? And you can toss your answer in the chat. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that if you'd like. Mm-hmm. Bova's, yes, Bova's is delicious. And don't say Little Italy. I agree with a lot of these comments that are coming in from everybody. Mr. Revere, molasses, a neighborhood that has witnessed waves of change. These are really, really great answers. And like many of you, the first thing that pops into mind are not the cannolis from Bova's, but the Italian-American community that creates those and brings us those delicious desserts, and that still resides there in the North End today. Now, growing up, I knew that my great-grandparents lived there on Hull Street, and in doing family research, I was able to pinpoint their restaurant to the location of today's Strega on Hanover Street. However, as one of the original and not made parts of the town and then city of Boston, the North End has always been one of the most densely populated neighborhoods with great access to the heart of the city. In the 18th century, as many of you noted, Paul Revere did live there, as did Thomas Hutchinson. But what a lot of people don't realize is that at that same time, a very large population of African Americans lived there up through the Foundation era through the 1800s. And it wasn't until I started flipping through the city directories a few years ago for Boston that I really got a handle on the extent of the North End's Black population, especially in what was then called the Ann Street area. Now, the image that you're looking at is a part of a map of Boston from 1838, and it is part of the Leventhal map collection that the Boston Public Library hosts and is one of my favorite websites. This shows a close-up of the North End. And as you can see, if you're familiar with the neighborhood, a number of the streets have changed their names over the years. My primary focus tonight is on Ann Street, which today is known as North Street. It was established originally in 1708 and ran from Dock Square, which you can kind of see the direction of in the lower left corner, and traveled up into Commercial Street, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the image. The name was changed for the southern section from Faneuil Hall to North Square in 1852, and then for the north section up to Commercial Street in 1854. Now, like many large towns and cities, Boston had directories starting in the 18th century. These were produced by various individuals, including John Norman, Edward Cotton, Charles Stimson, and also companies like Sampson, Murdoch and Company, and R.L. Polk and Company. The goal of these publications was to make money for the publishers, obviously, but also to provide a sometimes vague location for every individual company or business in that town or city. These would also list the various churches in the area, who was on the fire companies, nurses, elected politicians, all different kinds of information, and would host advertisements from companies in that town or city. The general price of a publication like this would be around $2. And while Boston does not have a city directory for every year, it has a pretty complete run from the 1780s up through 1943. And that's when the advent of telephone books started to replace these types of publications. Our friends over at the Boston Athenaeum have very kindly digitized a large number of these publications and made them free to browse. And I was looking through these in search of another person. And I was looking through the PDF of it, and I started to realize that the directories between 1813 and up through 1849 were segregated by race. Listed either as Africans in the earliest years and then later people of color, Black Bostonians were relegated to the back of the directories. And looking through these sections in the backs of all those city directories, I started to write down names and attempted to make some sense of where people were living and what they were doing at that time and how it might have changed over years. And while some of the information made a lot of sense to me, a lot of Black Bostonians were living during this time period on what we call the North Slope of Beacon Hill today by the African Meeting House, on streets like Myrtle or Belknap. And many of those individuals were working as hairdressers or bootblacks. A few specific names started to stand out to me, especially because they started to pop up in streets that I associated with the North End, and I started to do more research on them. The image that we're looking at in this slide is the first page of the People of Color section for the 1821 directory. And one reason I chose this image is because I liked the variety of people and names and locations that it shows. And you really need to have a good handle on where streets are and how they've changed. Now, while today Robinson Lane is located in the Dorchester neighborhood, in 1821, it ran between what is now Unity and North Streets in the North End. Spring Street, where Jesse Allen worked as a laborer, is located right around the corner from the old State House downtown. May Street, where Julius Angel lived, is what we now call Revere Street in Beacon Hill. And White Bread Alley, one of the more unique names of streets in Boston during this time, is now Harris Street and runs between what is now Hanover and North Streets in the North End. As I said, doing research like this, it's really helpful to have a handle on how names have changed. And one of the best guides I've found for this type of research so far is titled A Record of the Streets, Alleys, Places, etc. in the city of Boston, which was published in 1902 and is available on Google Books as a free download. Now, as you can see in the small section for the A's, surnames, in this section, there's only one woman listed, and her first name isn't even written down. Based on previous city directories, Widow Argo might have been married to Nicholas Argo, who lived in Creek Square. Women are the least represented in city directories, whether they were white or Black, partially because they often did not work outside of the house. They lose their legal autonomy when they marry. And there are a number of other reasons why women might not have been included, partially because these lists are not completely comprehensive. Now, to give you an idea of just how few women actually had jobs that had a title or were officially paid, I looked at two different years that I pulled out at random. The first year was 1830. There were 185 names listed in the People of Color section. And of those, one woman ran a boarding house, one woman was a doctress, 5 women were listed as washerwomen, 6 women have the occupation of widow, with 1 woman listed as the widow of, and 7 women have no occupation whatsoever. During the same year, the most common occupation for male Black Bostonians was hairdressing, with 1 individual employed as both a hairdresser and a musician. In 1838, there were 200 names listed, and of those, 1 woman was employed at washing and ironing, 4 women were listed as widows, with 2 listed as the widow of, and 3 had no occupation listed. The most common occupation for the men that year was dealing in clothes, whether it was owning a new clothing shop, running a secondhand shop, or having a combination clothes store and what we would refer to today as a dry cleaning store. Now, it isn't that the female population of Boston fell dramatically during those 8 years, but there were a lot of outside influences, like I said earlier, marriage, death, moving away, that made the numbers change during those 8 years. Trying to find information on women during the 1800s is a very difficult task. And trying to find information on Black women during this time period is even more difficult. And you might think that being a doctress in the 1830s, as Linnea Stewart was, would rate a newspaper article or an advertisement or a mention, but unfortunately you would be wrong. There is no trace of Linnea Stewart whatsoever. But in 1938, one woman not even listed in the directories as having a job or a residence in the city of Boston made all the newspapers in the area. And that was probably kind of a unique experience for her as a Black woman. Now, the reason why she made it into the newspapers in 1838 was because she was arrested and had a public trial. While reading through the directories, Charlotte Goddard, seen here 4 lines down from the top, jumped out at me as she was listed a few times as owning or running a shop or a boarding house at various locations, first on Broad Street and then on Ann Street. This image shows her as a shopkeeper at 147 Ann Street in 1836, just 2 years prior to her arrest. There's also a William Goddard listed in this section of the directory in a few different years. And he's listed generally as a shopkeeper on or around Ann Street, but never at the same number as Ann. And it's possible that they were a father and daughter, a husband and wife, brother and sister, cousins, or maybe they were just 2 people with the same last name in the same location with no real family connection between them at all. I haven't been able to find any vital records for Charlotte Goddard to help ascertain that relationship. If there is any, I have help over at the Boston City Archives combing through records to see if we can find any information on her. What little I do know, I have gleaned from newspaper reports. In 1838, when she was arrested, it was reported in an article by the Boston Traveler that she was 50 years old. While she had previously been listed as a shopkeeper or running a boarding house, in 1838, she was arrested for running a, quote, house of the vilest description in Ann Street. Now, it might not surprise some of the people on this program who have read about the history of the North End to know this, but during the 1800s, the North End was not really known as the best place to live. It was referred to later in the 1850s as the Black Sea, which was a nod to the number of Black sailors who lived in the area, or the Murder District, which was a nod to its high crime rates. Either way, no matter what you called it, it was an area that the respectable people of Boston should avoid. And while many people in the neighborhood had completely normal and or legal jobs, like owning a variety shop or working as a barber, places like Ann Street were the location of many of Boston's brothels. Though there is no definite number on how many brothels were in Boston during the 1800s, it's obvious from looking at the crime and court blotters in the newspapers that they were numerous and spread throughout the city. There were some that were being run by individual women, others were being run by men, and others were still being run by husbands and wives together. And both Black and white Bostonians were arrested and charged with this crime throughout the 1800s. Now, if you are interested in learning more about the brothels of Boston during this time, you're actually in luck, thanks to the city archaeology lab. During the years of the Big Dig, archaeologists were hired to excavate sites associated with the 17th and 18th century during the construction period to preserve history as it was being uncovered. And during the work in the North End, an archaeological deposit was found at 27 and 29 Endicott Street. Now, the building at that address had spent most of its time as a tenant building or apartment, but between 1852 and 1867, it was a brothel being run by 3 different madams over the course of 15 years. Most brothels that have been excavated are associated with classical sites like Pompeii in Rome, in Italy, and more Western sites here in the United States. There have only been a handful of sites in urban locations excavated in places like Washington, D.C. and New York. And because the site was not included in the defined scope of work for the Big Dig, archaeologists actually had to volunteer to excavate it on their own time. And it became an orphan collection for a number of years. It didn't have really anybody taking care of it or studying it. But recently, a lot of local archaeology students at places like Boston University and UMass Boston have been utilizing the objects in their master's and PhD work. And these are 2 items that were excavated. These items, a teacup on the left and a glass bottle on the right, are just 2 of the over 8,000 artifacts that were excavated from the privy or toilet of the site. And these are helping to shed a lot of light on life inside the building. During its use as a brothel, there were 2 definite sides to the building. There was a public side where customers were entertained, and a private side where the women lived in a type of communal housing. Items found in the privy ranged from alcohol bottles, medicinal items, jewelry, toys, and also items for the birds that the women kept there as pets. And while the site is a little after Goddard's brothel time period, and all the women employed at the Endicott Street brothel were white, it does give us an idea of what might have been at the Goddard brothel. There were probably a few higher end items in the public site section of the building, but most of the items would have been more utilitarian and would have been for the daily use of women there. The largest deposit did consist of glass items. Glass is one of the hardiest items that you can have in an archaeological deposit. And they included window glass, mirror glass, and over 200 glass vessels, with ceramic items being the most sturdy items that you can find at a site, were found mostly food consumption, then coming in a close second. Now, if you would like to explore the items excavated, you can see a digital catalog of them at the link in the chat that Sean's going to drop. The City of Boston archaeologist Joe Bagley and his team have spent a lot of time photographing, cataloging, and presenting these items for you to browse and learn from. But back to Charlotte. The trial of Charlotte Goddard attracted a lot of attention. And this might have been due to the fact that she was a Black woman charged with being a madam, or as one newspaper article implied, that while Charlotte Goddard took care of the daily business, the brothel was actually owned and operated by a policeman of Boston. There's also the fact that some of the witnesses were very young alleged sex workers there, and they also had testimony from the local watchman of the North End. So whatever the reason, whether it was one or many of those potential reasons, this trial made a huge splash. The article that you see here is from the Columbia Sentinel, and it went into great detail about the trial. With almost a dozen witnesses for both the defense and prosecution, it seems that the city of Boston was captivated by this trial. The defense during their time really claimed that Goddard was a humane and good-hearted person who might have just been a little bit of an inept individual, because she, quote, sheltered the houseless, gave home to the vagrant, clothed the naked, and fed the hungry. She shouldn't be punished for what the men and women did in her boarding house without her knowledge. The prosecution, on the other hand, went straight to the heart of the matter and accused her of promoting wickedness and moral ruin while making money off of these violations of the law and good character. In the end, Charlotte Goddard was found guilty of, quote, keeping a house of ill fame and fined $100. This is actually in line with the fines that other people who were found guilty of this crime were charged with. Usually it was somewhere between $50 and $200 total. If she was unable to pay for that fine within 10 days, she would be sent to the House of Corrections for 1 full year. Now, unfortunately, that little blurb describing her sentence in the Weekly Messenger newspaper on April 19th of 1838 is the last that we hear or read of Charlotte Goddard. She might have passed away or moved out of town, and there's always a possibility that she got married and disappeared into the records under her new husband's last name. However, not all of those who lived on Ann Street, as I said earlier, during this time period, participated in illegal business or fell victim to the crime and violence of the area. While I was looking through these city directories, one of the most unique names that I ran into was that of Emiliano F.B. Munderku. And with a name like that, I figured it might be possible to track him down through the historic documents and newspapers. Luckily, my bet paid off. But I had to spell his name literally 12 different ways to find him in each of the different sources. Once I had figured out that I needed to search with all U's or all O's or a mixture of each, the articles and petitions started to pour in. Born in Brazil sometime around 1795, Emiliano Felipe Benicio Munderku might have derived his surname from a local Brazilian indigenous tribe. Scholars Lloyd Belton and Professor Caitlin Fitz have also done research on him and have been very generous in sharing their work with me. And it's from them that I have learned a lot about his early life in Brazil. He fled Brazil in the 1820s, so he didn't spend a lot of time in his home country. We do know from later articles that he was considered a pardo, which might mean that he was an upper class educated biracial man. As a member of the city of Recife, located in northeastern Brazil, Munderku seemed to be on a really good trajectory for a stable and profitable life. He was a member of the local economy. He was a member of the military there. But in 1824, it all came to an end. The area was rife with tensions as multiple revolts and revolutions swept through the Caribbean and Central and South America. Now, according to some of his enemies, Munderku was heard praising Haiti's leaders and also heard to order his militiamen to attack the white residents of the city. And because of that, Munderku was threatened with execution. However, there's very little evidence that this actually happened, and this might have just been a tactic to force him to flee the country or to use these accusations as an excuse to kill him. Munderku fled from Brazil, went to Haiti for a few months, and then moved over to Venezuela, where he offered his services to help with Simón Bolívar and the revolutionaries there. Munderku was rebuffed by Bolívar and traveled to Boston in 1827 and settling here in town. During those first few days, though, Munderku was not given a very warm welcome to the city of Boston. Within 10 days of his arrival, he was ordered to leave the boarding house that he was staying in on Washington Street prior to his move to Ann Street, after some of the white people staying there refused to continue paying their bills if a Black man was allowed to stay. Even in spite of that treatment that greeted him to Boston, Munderku came to the aid of a newly arrived Polish refugee who had absolutely no money and gave him a suit of clothes. This refugee was Joseph Hordyński, who was an officer in the Polish army during the November 1830 uprising, who wrote a very well-received book about that titled The History of the Polish Revolution. By this time, Munderku had already established himself as a clothier in Boston who had the ability to reach out and help other people. And he also had become a married man. He became engaged and then married to Anne Marie Perot. The Perot family was part of the core of Boston's Black Catholic community during the 1800s. Settling first on Fish Street, which today is again part of North Street today, and then moving to Ann Street, the family was just doors away from where Munderku opened his shop. As very active members in the community at large, marrying into this family would have paved the way for Munderku into a very small but very supportive group. Unlike some other members of that supportive group, Munderku did actually begin to expand his sphere here in Boston, and he began to join abolitionist groups, which were mostly dominated by the larger Black Protestant community, which lived near the African Meeting House in Beacon Hill. As a member of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, Munderku would have a lot of help and a lot of benefits coming to his family from that community. And like a lot of other Black men in the city of Boston during the 1830s, Munderku did open a clothing shop, which was originally located on Ann Street, and it's there that his name first appears in the newspapers of Boston. Unfortunately, it was not for a good event. He had a fire break out in that shop on March 9th, 1830. And his clothing shop was not really damaged. It was the other parts of the building. And Munderku only suffered minor injuries. But the reason it made the news is because a female visitor to the building, his brother-in-law, Henry Perot, and a local hairdresser from the neighborhood all perished in the flames and smoke. Soon after that, his marriage to Anne Marie Perot dissolved, and Munderku soon got remarried to Harriet Jardine, with whom he had at least 6 children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. As a member of Boston's Black abolitionist community, perhaps that is what predicated his family's trip to Nantucket Island in November of 1832. Now, this is a picture of the African Meeting House on the island of Nantucket at the corner of York and Pleasant Streets today. It is owned and operated by the Museum of African American History, which also runs the Abiel Smith School and the African Meeting House here in Boston. Now, they traveled down to New Bedford in November of 1832, hoping to get onto a ferry that would travel them across to Nantucket. And Emiliano brought his wife and at least one of his children with him. The plan was to board the steamboat Telegraph. And when they got there, Munderku paid for the highest cabin fare for the ride. That would be $4 total for himself and his wife, and then $3 for his horse and carriage to be transported. Upon arriving onto the steamboat, however, the captain refused the family entrance into what was considered a superior cabin, even though that is what Munderku paid for, because the rules of the boat excluded Black people from that level of comfort and class of cabin. Instead, they were directed to the forward of the ship, where the accommodations were not as comfortable or safe. Munderku argued against this discrimination on 2 points with Captain Barker. Number one, he paid for that cabin. So as a paying customer, he should be allowed access to it no matter what his race. And secondly, his wife was ill. Munderku feared that if she was sent to the forward cabin, where the elements often worked their way in through the walls, she would become sicker and possibly even die. No matter what Munderku argued, though, Captain Barker refused Harriet Munderku access to the superior cabin. He allegedly declared that she ain't a lady, she's a N-word, when Emiliano pointed out how light his wife's complexion was and compared it to that of Captain Barker's own mother. As a final insult, Munderku's horse and carriage was not properly stored and ended up falling overboard. Not only was he out of money that he paid for the cabin they weren't allowed into, he also had to engage and pay people to rescue the horse and carriage from the water. They were finally refused service on board the Telegraph and put back on the shore, and had to wait 2 full days before they were able to sail to Nantucket on board the sloop Champion. Once he and his family got back to their home in Boston, Munderku did the thing most Americans would do when they experienced a situation like that. He sued on the grounds that the captain's actions were a, quote, violation of humanity. Now, while I know that in his career, Munderku filed for bankruptcy at least once, he was apparently able to utilize those connections that he had through the abolitionist community to engage 2 unique lawyers to argue for him. These men were Daniel Webster and abolitionist David Child. And through these 2 lawyers and their arguments, Munderku's debate with the captain, the information of that event was translated so well that it took only 4 hours for the jury to deliberate and return a verdict, finding the captain guilty and awarding Munderku $125 in damages. Unfortunately, Munderku's verdict did not stand for very long. Captain Barker appealed the decision to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and the ruling was overturned. And that was in January of 1834. This incident really frustrated Munderku. Like many others who had experienced prejudice in their lives, he thought maybe we should travel to a different place. And it's at that time that an invitation came inviting him and his family to return home to Brazil. There had been a regime change, and they were willing to issue him a pardon from the newly installed government. Munderku and his family took up that offer, disappear from Boston for a few years, but then pop back up in the 1840s. In the 1840s, Munderku's abolition zeal had hardened and became much more prominent. As an educated man who spoke multiple languages, he knew that using one's voice and one's name could be just as important as using the court system to right wrongs. One of the more unique petitions that Munderku signed, his autograph shown here in the slide, was filed in 1859. The header of the petition reads, "The undersigned respectfully pray that a law may be enacted prohibiting any person licensed to exhibit any public show or to open or maintain any theatrical exhibition or other public amusement in this Commonwealth from excluding any persons from any seat or place occupied by the audience or spectators on account of his race, opinion, or color." As you can see, Munderku's signature is located just below that of another Boston clothier, Coffin Pitts. Just 9 years earlier, Pitts had been intimately involved in the case of Anthony Burns and the effort to prevent him from being sent back into slavery. I've tried to find some information on Marcy Haves or Hawes, and I have not been able to find any information on her yet. Munderku also supported other petitions on equal education in Boston schools, the creation of the Massasoit Guard, which was a proposed Black militia unit predating the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and efforts to put an end to slave hunting in the Commonwealth. Obviously, their family supported their father in his attempts to make the world more equal. Munderku's eldest surviving son, Theodore, is also listed as supporting the petition of Robert Morris to create the Massasoit Guard. These petitions can be found at the Harvard Dataverse website within the digital archive of Massachusetts anti-slavery and anti-segregation petitions collection, which has over 4,000 petitions just like this digitized. We can also see that Munderku had these ideas for quite some time. As a member of the militia and military in Brazil, it makes sense that he would support the creation of what was then called the United States Colored Troops. And in 1836, Munderku once again makes the newspapers in January of that year. The newspapers reported on January 1st that there had been a, quote, great rejoicing among the colored people during their multiple meetings on January 1st at Tremont Temple with the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. During these celebrations, a prayer of thanks was given by Reverend Elijah Grissom, and officers were elected to oversee the event. Those chosen for these officer positions included some of the biggest and most important names from Boston's Black community, including William Cooper Nell as president, and William Wells Brown, Lewis Hayden, John T. Hilton, and E.F.B. Munderku, among others, as vice presidents. While we don't have any reaction from Munderku specifically about the news that a Black regiment would finally be allowed to enlist in the United States Army, we can surmise that he fully supported it and celebrated it. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment would be created just about a month later, enlisting men on February 10th, 1863. Unfortunately, Emiliano Munderku passed away on September 18th, 1863, soon after that article, after suffering from dysentery for 7 days. Cities like Boston would suffer from waves of cholera or dysentery quite frequently during the 1800s due to poor sanitation and water supply contamination. As a member of Boston's Black Catholic community, Munderku received his funeral out of the Chambers Street Catholic Church and was buried in the North Cambridge Catholic Cemetery. Unfortunately, like many others in his situation, we have been unable to find his specific burial plot. The records are not very thorough, though we have been able to find a large fragment of the gravestone of one of his sons, Henry, who predeceased him in 1850 after drinking ice cold water, possibly suffering from a heart attack, seizure, or stroke. Thanks to individuals like Emiliano Munderku, later generations of Black Bostonians were able to build upon his successes and learn from his experiences when dealing with discrimination, paving the way for people like those that fought in 1840 along the trains of Massachusetts, calling themselves Freedom Riders, who would then later inspire the Freedom Rides of the 1960s. Also paving the way for people who wanted to come from Massachusetts and travel down to South Carolina to aid the people there as teachers and nurses during Reconstruction. These names are out there in our documents, they are out there in our newspapers, and they're out there in your own neighborhoods. And next time that you're walking through that neighborhood, maybe you'll also stumble upon a unique figure like Charlotte Goddard, the brothel owner, or Emiliano Munderku, the freedom fighter from Brazil. Keep your eyes open. There are traces of them there just under the surface. And if you'd like to continue learning about a unique figure who lived in the Boston area, I strongly urge you to join us next, the February 15th for our next program, talking about Edmonia Lewis and her amazing artwork and support of this Black community here in Boston. Thank you very much.
All right, Jocelyn, I'm just going to drop that link in the chat real quick. Great. Okay, so thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Definitely didn't know a lot of those stories, and obviously I've been working for the Park Service for a while, so really appreciate it. Do have a couple questions, and if anyone does have any additional questions that you think of as we're asking some of these, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I think we can take about just under 10 minutes for Q&A. So first question that I have was a question kind of about, I think, the directory itself. And one of the questions was, were the addresses that you saw, like Boylston Market, were they residences or work addresses, or were they both?
So they were both. Generally, when you're looking at a city directory, you'll see person's last name, their first name, their occupation, and then it might say H with a period next to that, and that indicates that it's their home address. In terms of a lot of these 1800s city directories, it would say at times shop at Ann Street. But a lot of people had their shops and their homes at the same location as well. So we don't have extremely specific information always about where people are living and working and where the separation, if there is any, happen. But a lot of people, just like today, you know, in places like Eastie come to mind, you have the shop on the first level and then the apartment above it, so that they can easily get to their work.
Great, thanks. So next question is specifically about, I believe, one of the brothels that you talked about, and it was, how did they know it was a brothel? From the artifacts from the privy, or what were some of the other sources that identified that?
Yeah, so this is in regards to the 2729 brothel, Endicott Street brothel. They were excavating the site, and they started to find a lot of things that you might not find in a normal household. And this included a lot of syringes and things like glass applicators for diseases that you would get from sex work, such as syphilis. The fact that these lasted since the 1840s is pretty impressive, 1850s. But they started to also do research in the census records. And there is also a publication called something along the lines of a sporting guide to Boston, which listed in terms of quality and the types of women that you would find at that brothel in Boston. And the Endicott Street brothel was, I think, one of 6 brothels that were included, and it had a pretty high, I guess you might call it a star or Yelp rate. It was considered one of the better places to go to get that kind of entertainment if you happen to be visiting Boston. So taking the physical materials and combining it with the historic research, the investigators were able to really pinpoint the use of this building. And that was done mostly by the principal archaeologist that kept the collection for a while, Mary Beaudry, who had written extensively about it and then opened the collection to those students who are interested in researching it.
Great, thank you. So a couple more questions here. One I think is a pretty easy answer. Are the house numbers today consistent with the Ann Street listings in the directory, or are they different?
Wouldn't that be great? There are no specific maps that I've been able to find that list the lots with the numbers. Sanborn maps, Sanborn fire maps, which are used a lot in research like this, are amazing for that reason. They have the lines demarcated, they have the owners, they have the street number, they have the street name. Unfortunately, these are a lot of really, they're very hand-drawn. Some of them are kind of like if you closed your eyes and took a pencil and drew a map of Boston, and that's what they presented as their map of Boston. So as I said, I've been working with Marta Crilly, who's at the city archive, trying to run down where exactly these would be. In my mind, 147 would be closer to North Square and closer to Paul Revere House than to Faneuil Hall, because it's either going to be 0 at Faneuil Hall and working its way up to Commercial Street, or it's going to be 0 at Commercial Street and working its way down. And either way, it's going to be closer to the Paul Revere House, since that's basically the direct center of Ann Street. But I could also be wrong. They could have just numbered houses willy-nilly. History is not always make sense, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. So another question was, were any of the African Americans in the North End formerly enslaved?
Yes, there are definitely people living in the North End who were formerly enslaved, but I did not find any information about them. We do know that Darby and Cyrus Vassell from Cambridge, who worked and were enslaved at the Longfellow House, Washington headquarters, National Historic Site today, moved into both Ann Street and then moved over to Belknap Street and became members of the community there. And there will be a talk about the Vassell family, the Black Vassell family, later on in this series. But it's very squishy to try and figure out who was formerly enslaved and who was not. There were free people of color in Boston from very early on, and they didn't always write down that they were free or that they were enslaved. There are also a lot of similar names, and names change as, we think of our identity, our name, as being immutable and non-changing, but they had different feelings about names back then. So it's kind of squishy history.
So I think 2 more questions. Are there any monuments in the North End of African American people?
Well, it depends on what you think of a monument. One of the most prominent monuments associated with a Black Bostonian is the gravestone of Prince Hall, who founded the Prince Hall Masons. He has a very large obelisk gravestone with a bit of storytelling about his life in Copp's Hill Burying Ground, just up Hull Street. But other than that, there aren't any. One of the problems of the North End, similar to Beacon Hill, is that it's always been a place where people have lived, and we haven't been able to do a lot of archaeology in either place. So when we are able to, it's really important. But that also means that we don't have a lot of context to place these individuals within in those neighborhoods itself, unless something goes horribly awry or you decide to have an incredibly expensive multi-year highway project go straight through your neighborhood.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we can save the chat and try to reach out. We can give our respective email addresses, for folks who do have additional follow-up questions. But in the interest of time, I do want to close with a methodology question, and it is, what is your research process and how do you follow the story through the records? Because I know that, speaking from experience, it's not the easiest thing to do. So if you want to speak to that process, that would be great.
So this might sound kind of glib, but if you know what a murder board is, that's kind of my research methodology, along with taking a pot of spaghetti and throwing it against the wall. So I started off very methodical with creating Excel sheets with all the information from the back parts of the city directories and sharing it with my colleagues like Sean and other people. And then I just started Googling the heck out of these names. We have access to a lot of databases via our work, and also the Boston Public Library, whom we adore and love for these reasons, and started to just blindly search and blindly type names, and started to stumble into things, and then put the Munderku's name down for a few months, and then came back and ran into two people who were researching him on their own. So while I started off very methodically and ended very methodically in creating this presentation, the middle part is a mess, because I find that that is the easiest way to allow information to come to you without having like this kind of box that you're trying to shove these people into. As you heard during this presentation, they don't fit in a box. They are all over the place. They're all over the world. And there are people from all over the world who are interested in these individuals and their stories. So you have to kind of search with a purpose, but allow kind of the Google foo to really, push you into different areas, and trust that sometimes the document that is completely bonkers looking in your searching actually has the information that you're looking for. So start off strong and finish strong, but then completely just have at it in the middle is generally my way of researching.
Sometimes you just gotta throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. All right, so with that, I want to turn it back over to Karen. And speaking for myself, and want to let Jocelyn say, thank you all very much for coming.
Oh, goodness. It was just amazing. Also, I love research, so I'm like, yes, process. I love a good process. And it is very true. The BPL has great databases, so woohoo, research, we love it. You can always email ask@bpl.org any of your research questions. If it is specific for the national parks, I can also forward it along. But I believe the emails were also placed into the chat, so feel free to email that. Email Ranger Jocelyn and Ranger Sean directly. They're fantastic. I love this program so much. Thank you so much. And we will see you back here in a couple weeks, I believe on the 15th, and it will be Carving Out Our Own Path, all about, I believe it was Mary Edmonia Lewis, which will be very exciting. So thank you again for coming. See you guys in a few weeks.